Do you ever wonder where the time goes? You look up from a conversation or a piece of work and you think, gee, where did the time go? So it turns out that one place that time goes is to a hospital. Every minute, every hour that you lose track of during the day finds its way to a hospital where a person sits and waits that time for you. For a long time, my mom was in the hospital because she was very sick. She had tumors in her brain. And to treat this, she had 2 brain surgeries, 3 kinds of radiation, and some aggressive steroid therapy. During this time, during her treatment, she was largely confined to a hospital bed. The room she had was quite small. There was a window on the side. There were some flowers and cards from people on the sill, although by the end of the treatment, Mom couldn't actually see that far. There was a nightstand beside her bed. There was a table for her food. And there was a chair in the corner. It was green. It was vinyl, squishy, and it reclined if you wanted to stay the night. During this time, Mom slept a lot and ate very little. And my dad and I decided to stay with her 12 hours a day. We took it in 6-hour shifts. The shifts were very boring. I would go for a walk, check my phone, read a book. But it was hard. It was hard not to just be distracted by what was happening to Mom. And so inevitably I would spend hours just sitting there, waiting for something to happen. This is where you feel the waiting. Most days, eventually, Mom would wake up. She would open her eyes and I would say, "Hi, how are you? Nice to see you." And she would blink, she would move her mouth, but nothing would come out. And I would say, "Did you have a good little napper?" No response. And I would always ask, should we read from your book? Should we keep reading? She would blink or move her mouth, and I don't know what this meant, but I presumed that it meant yes. And so I would take her favorite book from the bedside, and I would keep reading from where we had left off. His mouth covered hers, waking her out of a half-dream and into fresh passion. He wanted her just as much, now that he knew what they could make between them, but with a fire that held steady on slow burn. This time, though desire was still keen, the madness was less intense. He could appreciate the subtle curves, the soft angles, the lazy sighs he could draw out of her with only a touch. It was like making love to some primitive goddess, naked but for the gold draped over her skin. After so long a thirst, he quenched himself slowly, leisurely, after that first greedy gulp. So Mom's favorite author is Nora Roberts. Clearly, some of you know Nora as the author of over 200 best-selling romance novels. The plots feature female protagonists in romantic and familial entanglements. This is called the Stanislavski sisters. The plot is thus. Stormy Natasha's wild, fiery beauty captivates Spencer Kimball. But will the handsome single dad prove the one man capable of breaching her well-fortified heart and taming Natasha? Mom had hundreds of these books in our house, and so we grabbed a bunch and brought them to the hospital. And so every day, she would lie there looking at me because I had pointed her head in my direction. And I would read to her these thinly veiled descriptions of Natasha's fiery sexual emancipation. Do you remember when you're a kid and you watch a film with your parents and a sex scene comes on? And you want to leave, but you can't because it'd be really obvious why. So imagine doing that, except you're narrating the sex scene to your parents. Eventually it got so awkward that I would read with like one eye on the next page, and I would, if it looked even remotely sexy, I would just skip over that page and hope that Mom didn't notice. Mom didn't have a private room at the hospital. So there we were. Day after day, I was in the green chair. And I would read to Mom for as long as she was awake. Sometimes that would be 10 minutes, sometimes it would be an hour. And life at the hospital goes on. You know, people walk by outside, nurses come in and out of the room. Mom's food, ominously, largely uneaten. A couple weeks into this process, I started to realize that I'd actually read some of these books before. I started to remember that when I was younger, like 12 or 13, I somehow discovered that these books that were all over the house contained these descriptions of sex. And my mom didn't just have romance novels, like she had real Harlequin pulp. You know, like Fabio on the cover, some busty damsel, like bodice rippers. And so I would sneak around the house and I would read surreptitiously like these descriptions of sex. And I have to tell you that some of my first erections came this way. Which means that my mom and I were getting off to the same stuff. So this revelation, I think, was not so much strange or weird as significant. You know, I think it's a real thing to recognize your parents as people in the way that you and I are people, and not as some mythological being called parent. Right? Like up until this point, I think my assumption was that my parents had had sex exactly 2 times. I have a sister. And it just never occurred to me that my mom would have this like rich and vibrant, quite tumescent emotional life. You know, the irony, of course, is that when by the time I realized this about my mom, that part of her life was largely dark. At this point in her treatment, even if she could have understood the question, like if I'd asked her about her life as a sexual being, I don't think, she definitely could not have articulated a response. And so it goes. And instead we just kept reading these novels, day after day, passing the time, waiting for my dad to show up for his 6-hour shift. Thanks.